Geneva is indeed a city where the world comes together. It comes together to think about the intellectual issues of the world. It comes together to think about the opportunities and perhaps even more so the challenges that confront the world. And as we think about the days and the years in which we now live and the future ahead, I think we now need to recognize that it has already become a digital world. It is a world, as you heard, that does not yet connect everyone. And I think one of the great opportunities of all of us alive today is to broaden the reach, to bring these opportunities to the rest of the planet. But as we do so, we also need to think about the challenges that exist on the internet already. As we do so, I think it's helpful to put in perspective what goes on here by looking at the past and what has happened in Geneva. Because it is a city where so many important steps have been taken over the centuries, and yet it is also a place where the world has not always succeeded, as we all appreciate. For me, I look to inspiration to some degree from Henri Dunant. If ever there was an unlikely person to found the spirit of Geneva, perhaps it was him. He was a businessman. He was a businessman who, by complete coincidence, found himself on the battlefield in what is now Italy, in Solferino, in 1859, the day of the most deadly battle in Europe since literally the Battle of Waterloo. He was there not because he was seeking a battle or even to help the people who had been wounded. He was there as a businessman to seek an audience with Napoleon III to ask for a concession of land. But what he witnessed that day opened his eyes, and as it opened his eyes, he used his voice to open the eyes of other people as well. He wrote a book, he published it, he worked together with a committee of 4 other people here in Geneva, and out of their work, there became an organization that all of us know and I think deeply appreciate so much, the International Committee of the Red Cross. And of course, what he created, in fact, was not only a blueprint for the ICRC, but a blueprint for the protection of people who were being maimed and injured by technology that was changing the face of war. Because one of the hallmarks of the Battle of Solferino in 1859 was the impact of new technology, rifled muskets, cannons, that literally were mowing down soldiers in a way that they had never suffered before. And he recognized that humanity needed to catch up with the technology it had created. It needed to organize itself in new ways, and he had an insight that no one had had before. He noticed that the first responders on the battlefield were typically medics of a uniformed army or volunteers. And he advocated, he persuaded, he succeeded in convincing the leaders of governments in Europe that despite the fact that the medics were uniformed soldiers of a specific army, they should be treated as neutrals. So they wouldn't have to retreat with their armies and leave the wounded behind, but instead they would be protected so they could treat those whose lives were at stake. And as neutrals, they would take on a new obligation, an obligation to treat the injured of all armies, even those they had been battling against. And this neutrality would extend not just to the medics, but to the volunteers who worked with them. The governments of Europe came together here in Geneva for a week in October of 1863. And on the 29th of October, they adopted this proposal. And on that day, the spirit of Geneva took root. And there have been many years and many issues where that spirit has served the world so well, so often addressing the new challenges of technology, challenges around chemical weapons, challenges that brought governments together to prohibit their use, challenges around the humanitarian law that would protect people, civilians, and the injured. challenges of new generations of nuclear weapons, including the intermediate nuclear forces, challenges that were often addressed by governments, and sometimes challenges that were addressed by people outside of government, as was the case with landmines before they led to the treaty in 1997. There is such a rich, a proud tradition on which one can build as we think about the future. And yet, as we do, I think it is equally important to remind ourselves that, like every place on the planet, success has not been uniform. There have been other decades and other challenges where the world came to Geneva and the world looked away. That was perhaps most pronounced, as we know, in the decade of the 1930s, when there was the invasion of Manchuria, when there was the crossing of the Rhine, when there was a recognition in the early 30s that the governments of the world had an opportunity to act to address what was clearly the spread of new technology that would change the face of warfare. And when the disarmament conference in the early 30s failed, there is perhaps one person more than any other person who recognized what had happened and why this was an issue not only for governments, but for technology and for the world. Perhaps not surprisingly, that person was Albert Einstein. As he thought about the meetings that had taken place in Geneva, as he thought about the failures of the conferences and discussions that had taken place here, he went to the core of the issue. He recognized that technology had advanced, and because technology had advanced, humanity needed to organize itself in new ways to manage this, and that humanity had failed to do so. And because humanity had failed, he said that, in fact, what the world was left with was these achievements of the machine age, but in the hands of that generation, technology that, in his words, were as dangerous as a razor in the hands of a 3-year-old child. And so as we think about the advances of technology, we can't help but think about what technology innovation has meant for weapons. Unfortunately, we all appreciate that the course of history has so often shown that it has led to the horrors of war, and it has led to even more powerful military might on land, in the water, in the air, and now in our generation, in our time, in a new place as well, in cyberspace. And so the fundamental question, in part, is what will we as a planet make of this new development? The reality is that technology in cyberspace is in many respects unfolding as technology always has, on land, on the water, and in air, because what are we seeing? We are seeing a new arms race. In fact, as you already heard, we've entered a new era. We've entered a new era of invisible weapons, because after all, when we talk about a cyber weapon, it's not as if it is something one can hold in a hand, like a gun, or look across and see like a plane or a missile, and yet its impact can be profound. And as we think about the year 2017, the year in which we come together here in Geneva, I believe that it is altogether possible that a generation or two from now, people will look back at this year and they will look at the 12th of May. And they will say that on the 12th of May, 2017, the world changed again. It changed because it was on that day, a Friday, that the so-called WannaCry attack was unleashed. By any measure, it was an extraordinary day and it was an extraordinary event. It was an attack that was launched using cyber weapons that had been created in one country and then stolen and used by another. And even though the attack was thwarted almost by coincidence by a computer scientist in the United Kingdom, before it ran its course, it impacted, it damaged, it impaired over 200,000 computers in 150 countries. Think about this. In the history of our planet, in the course of humanity, has there ever been a single attack by any nation that affected as many other nations simultaneously as that attack did on the 12th of May? I don't think one can find one. If that were the only thing that had happened this year, this would be a year that was unlike any other. And yet the challenge is that's just the biggest attack that happened in the month of May. In the month that followed, in the month of June, we saw another attack, the NotPetya attack. Here was an attack that was focused on disrupting the electrical grid and the civilian infrastructure, the private economy of a nation, Ukraine. It ultimately spread beyond Ukraine, but not before it damaged that country. And of course, this follows, as we all know, a tumultuous year and a half when cyber weapons and tools were used to attack politicians and the political process in the United States. It is a process that we have the opportunity as a technology company literally to follow across Europe and around the world because we see what technology is doing. We hear from our customers. What we have seen just over the course of the last year is attacks spread across the map of Europe, including efforts to hack into the emails of every single major candidate seeking the office of the presidency of France. It is not something that is confined to acts by a single nation. We see each month attacks coming from different countries and in different parts of the world. And of course, today it is easy to look at this and say, well, thank goodness they're only attacking machines. One might even say, isn't it a good thing that these are not like conventional weapons that are actually seeking to harm people? But this is where we need to think again. And if what we want to see is what the future may hold, we should go back to the 12th of May and we should consider the audit report that came from the British government just 2 weeks ago. What it showed was that the WannaCry attack disrupted and impacted hospitals across the United Kingdom. And by impacting hospitals, it impacted individuals. As the National Audit Office showed, there were 6,912 people, patients, individuals who were scheduled for medical care on that day. They were scheduled to see a physician, or they were scheduled for a surgical operation, and their medical care that day was canceled. There were ambulances on their way to take patients to hospitals that were diverted to other hospitals instead. So this is about people. And I think perhaps one of the most sobering things it means, especially for people who have the opportunity to come together in a place like Geneva, is what it in fact says about the course of the world. Because it was here in Geneva in 1949 that the world's governments came together and pledged that they would protect civilians even in times of war. And yet let's look at what is happening. We are seeing nations attack civilians even in times of peace. And yet it is so clear that this issue is either going to become more serious or less so. It will either get better or get worse, but on its current course, one should certainly not be sanguine. Because we live in a world where the infrastructure of our lives is ultimately vulnerable to the weakest link. Increasingly, we live in a world where if you can hack your way into a thermostat, you may be able to find your way across the electrical grid. And think about what the future holds. It is clear where the world is going. We are entering a world where every thermostat, every electrical heater, every air conditioner, every power plant, every medical device, every hospital, every traffic light, every automobile will be connected to the internet. Think about what it will mean for the world when those devices are the subject of attack. Think what it will mean for the people of Geneva when they leave their office in the evening to drive down the highway if we have to live in a world where nations and others feel free to attack the grid that is controlling the automobiles that are driving home for us. The reality is that digital technology has become the cornerstone of our lives, and therefore one of the great questions of our time is this: what is to be done to protect this planet and all of this digital technology? As someone who comes from a company like Microsoft, who spent almost a quarter of a century working in the tech sector, I would absolutely be the first to say that, in fact, we have the first responsibility. After all, we build this stuff. And when we think about attacks in cyberspace, we have to recognize that not only is cyberspace the new battlefield, but it's a different battlefield than land and air and sea for the most part. Because when there are attacks on cyberspace, there in fact are attacks on private property. It may be against the phone that is in your pocket, or the laptop that is on your desk, or the servers that are in our data center, or the cables that are underneath the ocean that we operate, that connect data centers together. So of course we must adopt this sense of responsibility that is incumbent upon us to do a better job than anyone else, to act first. And that is in fact what we are doing as a company. It is what I believe our industry is working to do. We're working to engineer security into every part of our products so that the access to networks is governed properly, so that there's protection for information, there's protection against the inevitable threats that are unleashed every day, and security engineers are given the tools to manage technology more effectively. It is an area of huge investment. As a company, we at Microsoft spend $1 billion every year just on security innovation. But in a sense, the biggest asset we now have, one we didn't have a decade ago, is the use of data. We use our access to data to identify threats as quickly as we can, to respond to them, to protect people from them, and to help those who are hurt. In so many ways, however, we need to recognize that this is a shared responsibility. Oh, it is a responsibility that starts with technology companies, but it is a responsibility that then connects to every customer on the planet, every business, every government, every individual. Because like all such things, the security is only as good as it is when it is put to use. One of the interesting facts about cybersecurity attacks is that 90% of all of these attacks begin the same way, by somebody clicking on a link in an email that they receive. As we've sought to protect people more effectively, one of the things we've learned is that human nature is both a wonderful and challenging thing. As somebody said at a conference I was at earlier this year, it turns out that every organization has at least one employee who will click on anything. So we need to protect people from their bad habits. But more than that, we need to help customers, governments, NGOs, companies modernize their technology. Because the threats are racing forward, and it has become so clear that it is impossible to protect oneself from the threats of the present by relying on tools from the past. In fact, that is what we're seeking to do. In many ways, in a way that no one would have predicted 5 years ago, it has become the role of tech companies to be the first responders on this new battlefield. Because we see the threats first, and we're in a position to act quickly. And so it is this role of first responders that we've taken on for ourselves, and it's something I believe we need to continue to do. We need to think about all of the appropriate tools that are at our disposal. Interestingly, one of the tools that we've discovered, not surprisingly, perhaps, is the combination of technology with the rule of law. That's why we at Microsoft have developed a new tool to fight back, to protect people. It's a new court order that we've been able to go to court of the United States to seize control lawfully by judicial mandate of domains that have been hacked so we can identify what customers are being attacked by nation states. And then we can go to those customers as we do to let them know and to protect themselves and stop the attacks from recurring. In fact, this is something that we have done now over the last 16 months with over 75 domains to help customers in 91 countries around the world. It has inspired us to think about what we as a tech sector can and need to do, because we need to play our part. We need to live up to our responsibility, not just as individual companies, but as a group and an industry. That's why one of the things we've called for is a new tech sector accord. We've called for the companies in the technology sector, in effect, to adopt the same principles that the medics did of armies after the Battle of Solferino. To recognize that we should come together and pledge to work together and to live up to a set of principles that we should all adopt. Principles that would commit us to say that we will not help any government attack anyone, anywhere. To the contrary, we will assist anyone who is injured anywhere, just like the medics and volunteers were called upon to do. And in fact, we'll work together more closely to share information about threats and to respond more quickly. In effect, even in a world where there is growing nationalism and populism, even in a world where there might be growing skepticism at times about what governments can come together and accomplish, we believe that the spirit of Geneva provides a compelling example. And that's why we've called on governments to think about giving technology companies the opportunity to work together, in effect, as a neutral digital Switzerland to protect people around the world. But finally, I would say this: we also need governments to act. I think one can look at all of these issues and ask, can't the technology sector solve this problem by itself? The answer is no. It is a resounding no, for one simple reason. Nation-state attacks are growing because of increasing investments that are leading to increasingly sophisticated cyber weapons. We simply cannot live in a safe and secure world unless there are new rules for the world. Just as the world discovered that it could not prevent the scourges of war unless there were international rules to govern what happened on land and on the sea and in the air, we now live in a world that requires that we have established rules for cyberspace as well. Now, the good news is we don't have to build on a blank piece of paper. There are many rules that are already before us, and some of them you all and others may well conclude should and even do apply. There is so much room for a real conversation about the interpretation and the meaning of Article 2, Section 4 of the United Nations Charter. There is so much opportunity to look at the other sources of international law that exist today, to look at the other steps that governments have taken, and to be inspired and even build upon some of the other actions that have happened here in Geneva. Certainly for me, one of the greatest sources of inspiration is, in fact, what happened here, not just in this city, but in this building in 1949, when one thinks about the Fourth Geneva Convention. I have said, as you heard earlier, that we do need to build upon that. The world needs a new digital Geneva Convention. It needs new rules of the road. What we need, we believe, is an approach that governments will adopt that says they will not attack civilians in times of peace. They will not attack hospitals. They will not attack the electrical grid. They will not attack the political processes of other countries. That they will not use cyber weapons to steal the intellectual property of private companies. That they instead will work together to help each other and the private sector respond when there are cyber attacks. In fact, what we really need is not only to recognize the need for rules, but frankly to know when others are violating them. Because of course the other cornerstone, or at least another cornerstone of international law, is knowing when violations take place. We need to recognize that that is a more robust challenge in cyberspace because one of the goals oftentimes of actors is to remain anonymous. But that is not a problem that is unique in the history of the United Nations or the history of weapons. It is a problem that the international community has come together in the past to address. It is a problem that the United Nations and the International Atomic Energy Commission continues to address each and every day. So here, too, there are examples that we can consider. There are lessons from which we can learn. But it does start with this. It starts with the basic proposition that every government, regardless of its politics or its policies, needs a national and global IT infrastructure that it can trust. As you heard earlier, this is not just the cornerstone of our lives, but it is a cornerstone that people need to be able to trust. For all of these reasons, the opportunity to come and spend time with you this afternoon is so important. Because this is so clearly a solution that the world needs. It is so clearly a solution that has so many important nuances, that requires that people from governments and from the diplomatic community and academic community, from NGOs and from private businesses address together. We all have opportunities to learn from each other. None of us, certainly none of us at Microsoft, has begun to figure out all the answers. But we do believe we know this. When we look at where technology is going, we believe that cybersecurity needs to be a cause for our time. We need to go forward with the clear recognition that this is an issue that has become fundamental to building a more secure planet and contributing to a better world. Thank you very much.